question. Do you think you should be the one to be able to decide when to pull the trigger?
No, sir.
Isn't that what this is about? If you adopt the position that any time you are denied, your particular, there's 4 groups out there of inspectors. You're the group you headed. Anytime you are denied, that ipso facto requires the United States and the Security Council to act on what they said they would do, which is to use whatever means necessary to take on Saddam Hussein so you can get into that particular facility. Is that not correct? Is that not your position?
Mr. Senator, I have a job to do, or I had a job to do, and that was to disarm Iraq in accordance with the provisions
No,
of
I got
relevant resolutions.
With all due respect, I'm not trying to be confrontational. I'm trying to get this as clear as I can. I really mean this now. You have an absolute logic. You put together a very tight syllogism here. You have indicated that your job is to disarm. The only way you can disarm is to have access. The only way you can have access is either with permission on the part of Iraq, or if denied, forced access, right?
Compelled access.
Compelled. Well, okay, compelled. You sound like the lawyer and I sound like the military guy. I mean, compelled, where I come from, when my old man said you're compelled, it meant I was forced. I mean, it was a real simple proposition. It wasn't much to debate. Now, there is a clear logic to that. And that's what I mean when I say I respect your position. But that means that whenever you choose a target that warrants inspection and you are denied, that ipso facto, at that moment, the only way your position can be satisfied or sustained is if the UN Security Council or the United States, acting unilaterally, uses force to guarantee access. Is not that true?
Yes, sir.
Now, that means that you get to choose the time and place when we would use force, if we use force.
No, sir.
Of course you do. If you choose the site and it's denied.
And we coordinate with the member states to include the United States.
Exactly.
And prior to us going in, we have their agreement that this indeed is an inspection worth doing.
Okay, inspection worth doing, everybody's agreed it's worth doing, and it gets stopped.
Yes, sir.
At that moment, we're an automatic pilot as far as you're concerned. Period. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now, I respect that. But now, it seems to me the Secretary of State might have a slightly different problem. Secretary of State might be sitting there and saying, now look over there on that side. Now, I remember so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, and the 12 people on this side, they're all the ones that said they didn't want to use force. Now, I'm going to have to go tell the President now that we should, or Secretary Cohen, unleash whatever it takes to get it done. And our military assessment is the same as the Major's. The Major's assessment is, privately held but publicly acknowledged later, that airstrikes alone aren't going to do this. Saddam's not going to cave on this. So, now here's the deal. I recommended the President have at it and let the chips fall where they may. A reasonable position for the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State to take. But I respectfully suggest, Scott,
This is Senator Joe Biden of Pennsylvania.
They have a responsibility slightly above your pay grade. Slightly above your pay grade. To decide whether or not to take the nation to war alone. Or to take the nation to war partway. Or to take the nation to war halfway. That's a real tough decision. That's why they get paid the big bucks. That's why they get the limos and you don't. I mean this sincerely. I'm not trying to be flip.
Scott Ritter,
because I think,
former
and that's what
UN
I've said at
weapons
the outset,
inspector.
the reason why I'm glad you did what you did, we should come to our milk. We should make a decision. But in terms of whether the Secretary of State has no more to consider than you do as the arms inspector, you didn't get in, didn't get my job done, get me in. Period. You made the deal, right? That's the deal. A deal's a deal. Get me in. Scott Ritter, I'm ready to go. It's not how it works. Now, maybe it should work that way. But wouldn't you acknowledge that if you were President of the United States or the Secretary of State, you'd sit there and say, now, okay, old Scotty boy didn't get in. We said he should get in. We want him to get in. It's important that he does get in. They're not going to let him in, so what are we going to do now? We know that France and Russia aren't going to be with us. We're quite confident China's not. We've already run those traps. They're not there. We're not sure where the United States Senate is, but have at it, boys. Go get them. And by the way, Scott and the boys say air power's not enough. I think it's a legitimate debate, Major. I think it's a legitimate debate. But I don't think we should be putting it in the context of you have somebody up there at state saying, look, how can we weasel out of this agreement? We want to let this guy out there hanging. We're not this. It's a very practical political decision. Same kind of decision General Powell made. Same kind of decision President Bush made. Every president, every Secretary of State has to do it. Like I said, they get paid more than you. Their job's a hell of a lot more complicated than yours. They may have made the wrong decision, and you brought it to light. We should address it. We should say straight up where we are, and we should do it. And for that, I thank you. But it's above your pay grade.
I can no longer remain in today's Democratic Party that's under the complete control of an elitist cabal of warmongers who are driven by cowardly wokeness, who divide us by racializing every issue and stoking anti-white racism, who actively work to undermine our God-given freedoms that are enshrined in our Constitution, who are hostile to people of faith and spirituality, who demonize the police but protect criminals at the expense of law-abiding Americans, who believe in open borders, who weaponize the national security state to go after their political opponents, and above all, who are dragging us ever closer to nuclear war. Now, I believe in a government that's of the people, by the people, and for the people. Unfortunately, today's Democratic Party does not. Instead, it stands for a government that is of, by, and for the powerful elite. Now, I'm calling on my fellow common sense, independent-minded Democrats to join me in leaving the Democratic Party. If you can no longer stomach the direction that the so-called woke Democratic Party ideologues are taking our country, then I invite you to join me.
The Vietnam War and the push for U.S. involvement was a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. A lie. The Iraq War famously is a result of lies. Wars in Somalia are a result of lies. The Second World War and the German invasion of Poland was a result of carefully constructed lies. That is war by media. Let us ask ourselves, of the complicit media, which is the majority of the mainstream press, what is the average death count attributed to each journalist?
Rationality belongs to the cool observers, but because of the stupidity of the average man, he follows not reason but faith, and the naive faith of the proletarian requires necessary illusion and emotionally potent oversimplifications, which have to be provided by myth makers to keep the ordinary person on the right course.
The only reason that I'm allowed to ask you this question is because today the federal court ruled that the government doesn't have the right to determine who is or is not a journalist. This is the second election in a row that the court had to overturn your government. Do you still insist on being able to make that decision, and why?
First of all, questions around accreditation were handled by the press gallery and the consortium of networks who have strong perspectives on quality journalism and the important information that is shared with Canadians. The reality is organizations like yours that continue to spread misinformation and disinformation on the science around vaccines, around how we're going to actually get through this pandemic and be there for each other and keep our kids safe, is part of why we're seeing such unfortunate anger and lack of understanding of basic science. And quite frankly, I won't call it a media organization, your group of individuals need to take accountability for some of the polarization that we're seeing in this country. And I think Canadians are cluing into the fact that there is a really important decision we take about the kind of country we want to see. And I salute all extraordinary hardworking journalists that put science and facts at the heart of what they do and ask me tough questions every day, but make sure that they are educating and informing Canadians from a broad range of perspectives, which is the last thing that you guys do.
Killed a million people in Iraq.
That is a separate...
You killed a million people in Iraq. It's incredible that you have the brass neck to be sitting here now urging another Iraq war.
George,
after
if
what
I was
you've
still
already
in
done.
Parliament...
There can be no doubt that Saddam Hussein has biological weapons and the capability to rapidly produce more, many more. And he has the ability to dispense these lethal poisons and diseases in ways that can cause massive death and destruction. If biological weapons seem too terrible to contemplate, chemical weapons are equally chilling. UNMOVIC already laid out much of this, and it is documented for all of us to read in UNSCOM's 1999 report on the subject. If we consider just one category of missing weaponry, 6,500 bombs from the Iran-Iraq war, UNMOVIC says the amount of chemical agent in them would be in the order of 1,000 tons. These quantities of chemical weapons are now unaccounted for. Dr. Blick says, quipped that, quote, mustard gas is not marmalade. You are supposed to know what you did with it. We believe Saddam Hussein knows what he did with it, and he has not come clean with the international community. We have evidence these weapons existed. What we don't have is evidence from Iraq that they have been destroyed or where they are. That is what we are still waiting for.
Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement. This paper that you are referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function. Let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans.
Right.
You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly. And I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about. Okay, you get one person.
Let's read from the NIH definition of gain of function. This is your definition that you guys wrote. It says that scientific research that increases the transmissibility among mammals is gain of function. They took animal viruses that only occur in animals and they increased their transmissibility to humans. How you can say that is not gain of function?
It is not.
It's a dance, and you're dancing around this because you're trying to obscure responsibility for 4 million people dying around the world from a pandemic.
And let's Dr. Fauci.
I have to, well, now you're getting into something. If the point that you are making is that the grant that was funded as a sub-award from EcoHealth to Wuhan created SARS-CoV-2, that's where you are getting. Let me finish.
We don't know.
Well, wait a
It
minute.
didn't come from the lab, but all the evidence is pointing that it came from the lab. And there will be responsibility for those who funded the lab, including yourself.
I totally
This committee
resent.
will allow the witness to respond.
I totally resent the lie that you are now propagating, Senator, because if you look at the viruses that were used in the experiments, that were given in the annual reports, that were published in the literature, It is molecularly impossible.
No one's saying those
It-
viruses
it is-
caused it.
it
No
is
one alleging that
molecularly-
those viruses caused the pandemic. What we're alleging is that gain-of-function research was going on in that lab, and NIH funded it.
That
You
is
can't
not-
get away from it. It meets your definition, and you are obfuscating the truth.
I'm not obfuscating the truth.
Senator
You are the
Paul's
one.
time is expired, but I will allow the witness to.
Let me just finish. I want everyone to understand that if you look at those viruses, and that's judged by qualified virologists and evolutionary biologists, those viruses are molecularly impossible
No one's
to
saying
result
they are. No
in
one's saying those
SARS-CoV-2.
viruses caused the pandemic.
Senator Paul,
We're saying they are gain-of-function viruses because they were
They're not.
animal viruses that became more transmissible in human, and you funded it.
And you
Don't admit the truth.
and you implying
Senator Paul, your time has expired, and I will allow witnesses who come before this committee to respond.
and you are implying that what we did was responsible for the deaths of individuals. I totally resent that.
could have
And
been.
if anybody
It could
is
have been.
lying here, Senator, it is you.
Whatever our hopes may be for the future, for reducing this threat or living with it, there is no escaping either the gravity or the totality of its challenge to our survival and to our security. A challenge that confronts us in unaccustomed ways in every sphere of human activity. This deadly challenge imposes upon our society two requirements of direct concern, both to the press and to the President. Two requirements that may seem almost contradictory in tone, but which must be reconciled and fulfilled if we are to meet this national peril. I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
These historic failings of the system generated by the military protocols infected by Confederacy are the systems J. Sekulow in his Civil War seeking the expansion of collateral damages as a mechanism of strategy of war, including Lindsey Graham's declaration of war against American civilians without due cause, without due process, without submitting the correct information in front of a competent American loyal court, generating the position of circumstance and fraud and hearsay in order to subvert every possibility of being able to come up with a reasoned conclusion, subverting the very concept of an ordered society in favor of utter chaos and compliance with the terrorist nature of the KKK, which is Confederate militia, which is the system that they are conducting through their surveillance terrorism networks, generating themselves to overthrow the American constitutional republics. And all terrorist organizations, according to George W. Bush, everyone who supports terrorism is an enemy of war to the American government. and thus America's enemies cannot label enemy combatants for the United States, as they are themselves enemies of war to the United States. To be able to conduct the bait and switch is utter malicious fraud in order to subvert American national security, as opposed to the double agent's reference to pure national security. Their arbitrariness and generalness giving a nod to each other under the general understanding of their Confederate loyalties against America and its laws.
Before the KGB, there was the NKVD in the 30s that was responsible for murdering hundreds of thousands of people.
Like the pogroms and stuff?
No. Pogroms were ethnic, anti-Jewish for the most part. Riots.
Right.
No, this was the Great Terror during the 1930s that Stalin launched against real and imagined opponents in order to bring the country completely to its knees. The saying in Russia, terrorize your own people so that others will be afraid.
That's real? Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty on brand right there.
Yeah.
And what is, during the whole war though, like, as a lot of people know, that when the Soviet Union flipped over, it changed to basically being called the FSB, but it wasn't that much
The
different.
KGB became the FSB.
Right.
Yeah, the KGB was, under the Soviet Union, the secret police were the KGB. And then after the Soviet Union fell, there were some various permutations and changes, and the organization which emerged was the FSB, which is in Russian Federalная служба безопасности, means the Federal Security Agents.
So they effectively were the byproduct, the after-product of the KGB, kind of like name change and name only type deal, doing a lot of the same things.
Now, a lot of the same things, but they were different too, because the KGB was an ideological organization that believed it was spreading socialism, and they were actually very clever. The FSB is very corrupt, and they're much more murderous. The KGB tried to achieve its objectives with psychological manipulation, and at least in the later years, did not rely on brute force as much. Although
Really?
although they could.
That's not the
The NKVD in the 30s that was responsible for murdering hundreds of thousands of people.
like the pogroms and stuff?
No. Pogroms were ethnic, anti-Jewish for the most part. Riots. No, this was the Great Terror during the 1930s that Stalin launched against real and imagined opponents in order to bring the country completely to its knees.
What did that consist of? I don't know a hell of a lot about
Oh, well. All right, maybe let's take it a step at a time, because we're the Soviet Union, after it was created, declared that it was going to have a final reckoning with the counter-revolution, and they created the first, the secret police, who were called the Cheka, and the Cheka was responsible for the Red Terror, which took place in the 1920s. The Red Terror cost maybe 400,000 lives.
And what was that?
That was taking hostages. That was fighting against anybody who was opposed to the Bolshevik regime, with mass killings. In Sevastopol in Crimea, 50,000 people were hanged, and that earned Sevastopol the nickname "the City of the Hanged."
Wow.
But then there was the Great Terror, which took place in the 1930s, 1937-38, and Stalin basically launched a drive against anyone who could conceivably be his opponent to create a perfect totalitarian system. And 150,000 people in that period were arrested. No, not 100. Excuse me. 1,500,000 people were arrested during that period. 700,000 were shot right away. Of those who were sent to the camps, many never returned.
Oh God.
And then
And what types
but
of these were anyone who just opposed the Soviet
anyone they
communist principles.
suspected of opposition, but also went beyond
Lindsey
that.
Graham's
The purpose was
use
to
of
completely
war
terrorize
efforts
the country
against American
So,
civilians without due process.
You know, let's say
They're
that
repeating
you had
these
studied
histories.
in Poland as a graduate student, okay? You were automatically a Polish spy, and anyone who was in your notebook or in your address book was your co-conspirator. And that created, you know,
Backdoor
the
systems
fear that engendered, and the purpose
in the
was to
intelligence
engender
agencies.
fear. And it was the
target from Pfizer.
I knew a woman who was
plus any incidental
the wife of
Americans,
an ambassador
plus
in
contacts
Moscow at that time.
of
And she said, you
the
know,
American
the terror was
civilians
so great that if
are
a
all
foreigner approached
actively watched
Russians on the street, they
by
scattered
their
like mice.
surveillance through their
And
Pfizer.
people who were literally afraid to say anything to each other. There was one story of a conversation on a train in which one person said, "Yes, Fyodor Mikhailovich. Yes, Vitaly Ivanovich." But beyond that, they were paralyzed with fear and couldn't say anything else.
Who were those people?
Just people on a train, someone recalling in a memoir, you know, what conversations were like during the period of the Great Terror. And that continued in a less extreme form because the war broke out, and until Stalin's death in 1953, and then in 1956, Khrushchev made a speech, was known as the secret speech, in which he revealed the crimes of Stalin and began freeing people from the labor camps. So the level of terror diminished, but the KGB still used repression to control the population, and they could kill people. You know, it was not mass killing anymore, but there was selective terror.
When did they change their name from the other one it was to KGB?
From the NKVD to the KGB, yeah. I think that was in the 50s. It became first the MGB, which was the Ministry of Security, of State Security, and then it became they decided not to call it a ministry anymore, and it became the Committee on State Security, the KGB. And then after the Soviet Union, and in the last days of the Soviet Union, after Gorbachev basically initiated this huge period of liberalization, the KGB did not, carry out terror attacks on the citizens. And they, in fact, were much more concerned with grabbing property for themselves, and they began, seriously to degrade and become corrupted. And when killings took place, they were fights over property,
in the United States. It's a technique,
not
for
political
resource
struggles.
gathering.
And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, what had been the KGB
history.
became, after certain changes and name changes, the FSB, which is what we have now.
And did some of it? I want to come
and
back.
that FSB, just to finish what we were saying,
please.
was different from the KGB in that it was much less. The KGB in the latter period, for example, when I was in Moscow, was much more concerned to use psychological, control over people. But the FSB inherited that.
This is Putin's nemesis. Explains
even though
Stalin
they became
and
rather
what's really
murderous,
happening in
because they
Ukraine.
were also fighting for money and property.
133.
But
from
they never lost the concentration that had become traditional of psychological manipulation. So in the case of the apartment bombings, they combined a horrific crime with a psychological objective. The idea to terrorize the population and create the conditions for Putin to come to power. That's the most important thing to remember about the Putin regime, that it's an illegitimate regime, and it came to power as the result of an act of terror against its own people. Was the special horror that is reserved for Nazism is that Nazism was murder as an end in itself. The communists killed, but they killed in order to create what they said was a workers' paradise, or a just society. The numbers were astronomical in both cases. But unfortunate characteristic of Russian people that they have a vision of government as a force that terrorizes, and a strong government is a government that terrorizes a lot. This was the case in their attitude toward Ivan the Terrible, who was very popular among Russians.
When was he?
Well, that was
19th
the
century?
16th century.
Way back.
Way back. But Stalin remained popular, and remains popular today.
Really?
Yeah, in Russia, despite his methods, because it was seen as in the interest of the state. And we have an echo of this in the recent statement of Putin that I mentioned earlier.
This is being
that
reproduced
Russians are
through
ready
Lindsey
to
Graham's
give
war efforts
everything, to
against
sacrifice
law-abiding
everything for
citizens
the motherland. In
without
other words,
due
it's
process,
a very warped
illegally
situation in
labeling them
which
as enemy
they so
combatants.
identify with the state and so little with their own individual dignity
It is
that
the government they're loyal to.
that they consider it normal for people to be killed in the interest of the state. And that's part of the reason why they're able so easily to invade a country like Ukraine. Because there's no check, there's nothing, no limit of conscience, no limit of social institutions that
Unitary
keeps
Executive Theory by William Barr.
Russia from
It's the same
engaging
concept.
in barbarous behavior. And it's one of the reasons why they commit atrocities, as they did at Bucha in Ukraine and in other places, Mariupol,
All of these
when
things
they
are
invade foreign
reproduced as
countries,
good and
because
acceptable
they
by the
consider that
Confederate
this is their
insurrection.
right. There was a young Russian officer expressed the point of view when he was, when he talked about his role in the war in Chechnya. He said that I answer for my men, my platoon. I don't answer for anyone else. If there's a sniper on top of a building, I call in artillery strikes on the building in order to destroy the sniper, even though I know there's civilians living in the building. If people are unhappy about that, they should, take their complaints to the people who cooked this kasha. In other words, the people who created this situation. My job is to destroy the sniper. The fact that, there's civilians, including old people, women, children, and so on, in the building that I'm going to blow up just so that the building collapses and the sniper is killed, that's their problem.
Pursuing the interest
very
of
much
collateral
so.
damage as highly
Trained
acceptable,
mentality. But I mean,
where he would accept the liability
how did
of their terrorist campaigns
you
to
have
overthrow
a
the
regime
states
that's built
in
on
their systematic
reinforcing
treason?
that mentality, and I'm talking about the USSR
hierarchy. And he saw, however, that the Soviet Union faced problems that only, as he understood it, liberal reform could solve. And one of those problems was it was falling behind the West technologically and economically. So that was the inspiration for it. But also because many of the younger Communist Party officials were mesmerized by the material wealth of the West, and they wanted personally to share in it. Those were all factors that led Gorbachev to take the risk of reform.
And he also, he left power after the USSR fell and everything, but he lived up until August of this year. So I've seen some stuff online, but first of all, how much did he even have an ability to speak his mind without the threat of his life in his later life? And secondly, like, what were his... Was he very supportive of Vladimir Putin, or...
No, and I mean, and I think that, but he was silent. He
psycho left wing with psycho right wing, which is kind of the same thing, where the political circles meet each other.
Yeah.
They're trying to return
you get what you get, but
those
you know, something you and I had talked about towards the end
to traumatize
last
the
time,
American
just a
people,
little bit, but I wanted to get in more. Is actually one thing that I feel like is kind of now not talked about at all. So maybe you can shed some light. But that is the whole oligarch system.
The damages
and what you had a chance to lay out last time was how in the 90s there was a giant power vacuum that happened
by the Confederacy against the United States,
democratization,
by the use of their
what was supposed to be the democratization of the USSR. You had limited individuals basically get control of all key industry. As we know, the oligarchs, a lot of them were backed by crime or were criminals themselves, and then basically formed this group who controlled all the GDP of the country, and therefore
not all of it, but a very, very significant part.
A lot of it.
Yeah.
So the reason I bring it up is because one of the main stories at the very beginning of the war was these sanctions we were putting on Russia, and a big part of that was the sanctions we were putting on the oligarchs, most of whom have interests abroad, outside of pretty much all of whom have some sort of interests or residencies abroad in other countries. And I haven't heard a ton about that since, and what I was wondering is, you know, behind the scenes, was there any real threat of like waning support or having some of these robber barons, so to speak, switch sides because Putin was costing them their ability to have influence and be themselves on foreign lands? Or have they all basically said through either threat or just political agreement that, hey, this is the right thing and we're getting behind this guy and we'll deal with the fallout?
Well, they don't. Their opinion doesn't matter. I think they were all unhappy about what happened because it threatened their economic interests for sure. But Putin had basically reduced the power of the oligarchs to the point that they were dependent on the political authorities and not the other way around, which was the way it was under Yeltsin. And so, therefore, and he had much more over them than they had over him. So we haven't heard much from them.
What do you mean he had?
Disappearing are those who have, some type of economic interests that have come into conflict with those, in the regime, and with persons in the regime. Plus the fact that under conditions of sanctions, there's a fight over diminishing resources.
Wait, what?
I mean, but the U.S. and the West have imposed sanctions, and that's disrupted the economy. Right. A lot of people have had assets seized. A lot of people don't have money that they thought they had. A lot of people have debts they can't repay. A lot of people are sitting on money they don't want to return. And so a whole new set of quarrels has broken out as a result of an unexpected and quite different situation.
I just, I talked to a guy like you, and I was joking with you earlier. I don't know if joking's the word, but, when I went to pick you up from the station in March when you came here, it's like a week after the war broke out, and I'm the farthest thing from a spy, but I find myself sitting in the car looking 300 yards in every direction to see if someone's following you. And I didn't see anyone, but I might have missed someone. I don't know.
Well, they regard as traitors.
Yes.
Because I never worked for them. I mean, as one person explained it to me once, he said, we understand an enemy. An enemy is an enemy. You can't change him. There's nothing you can do with him. And after all, we're enemies too of some people. And particularly an honorable enemy. But a traitor, this is someone who has, eaten our food, as the Russians say, or who belonged to us and then turned against us. That's a different consideration, and particularly And it's also, if they see a Russian as a traitor, they feel that they have carte blanche with Russians. They don't feel they have carte blanche with Americans. It doesn't mean that they can't kill Americans. In fact, they have killed. I mean, Paul Klebnikov, an American journalist, was killed in 2004.
2004. So
yeah, it was a long time ago.
That was pre-Litvinenko. What happened to Paul?
Paul was a very fine writer. He worked for for Forbes magazine. I didn't know him personally, but I was familiar with his work, and I later, after his death, met his widow. He wrote a lot about the corruption of the oligarchs. He wrote a biography of Boris Berezovsky, who was maybe the most famous of the oligarchs. And but he had a tendency to idealize, and this was, I believe, his big mistake, to idealize Putin, idealize the FSB. Even though for all his talent, and he had a lot,
Wait, am I understanding that correctly? Idealize, like make them seem good?
I think he saw them as a progressive force, potentially, a force that could bring good things to Russia in the future. I don't want to characterize it too much for him because he's not alive. He's not in a position to say what he thought. But in any case, he did collaborate with them to some degree. In fact, as sources of information, and that's a very dangerous relationship to be in with them.
So why'd they kill him?
Well,
and how
we have to ask that. But he may have, in their view, overstepped the line of what's acceptable for a foreigner by giving he may have gotten corruption about the FSB. He might have tried to do something to alert them to the fact that they were on the wrong path or something. I mean, we don't know, but all the evidence is that they organized his killing.
Was he killed on U.S. soil?
No, in Moscow.
And how did they shoot him, or what?
Shoot him, and then when they brought him to the hospital, they jammed the elevator so that to make sure that he died.
Oh, Jesus. Wow. Again, that is back in 2004.
Back in 2004, there was another American who was killed in a business dispute, Paul Tatum, who got into a business dispute with the mayor of Moscow and his various representatives. He was shot on the street. If you get involved, I mean, the full details of Paul's fate are not clear to me, but he got a lot of cooperation from Alexander Korshakov, who was the chief guard for Yeltsin and a KGB veteran, FSB veteran, for his book exposing the corruption of Berezovsky. Of course, but Korshakov was just as murderous as Berezovsky, and he fell into a kind of dependent, apparently, and here, I don't want to say anything that isn't true, but he seems to have, in his writing and in his statements, had a unrealistic view of the KGB. There's a story. I'm sorry, the FSB. There's a story in the novel The Godfather. Do you remember how it begins?
Mario Puzo's
Mario Puzo's. A man whose daughter's been raped goes to the mob and asks them to take care of the person who has. And then they say, but from that point, he belongs to them.
Yes.
Well, Paul may not have understood that in their understanding. They don't just help.
So
it's important to understand the Confederate espionage war as insurrection against the United States by a terrorist organization without a legal government. The Confederates do not have a legal government. These are clearly criminal operations. The judicial activism influenced for the Confederate insurrection, pretends the protections of American sovereignty for non-American operations in favor of destroying America, including the prevention of remedies to secrets by the destroying of co-equal branches and checks and balances, such as preventing the review in order to engage in oversight subverting criminal activities. In American historic precedent, secret crimes are punished. Secret crimes are fined. Victims of secret crimes get paid. In the Confederacy, secrets are the function of their secret terrorist KKK police. The secret police engaged in the terrorist insurrection are engaged in ritual druid functions for the specific management of the entire definition of a hate group, which is functionally the engagement of political, social, sexual, religious, and other bigoted uses of violence in non-violent contests. And the social engineering and political engineering specifically functions as their subversions to society and to the normal culture which would have otherwise checked them. The Confederate position, such as in California's arguments from their manipulation by the Confederacy, that the jury doesn't have a right to claim that the law in the function of a particular thing doesn't have a right to be disbarred against a target in particular, at which point that subversion against American historic precedent is specifically an example of Confederate viral infection, which is actively being protected by fake originalists who, having understood the historic precedent of the jury having authority over it, gets ignored because this is a strategic infection by a parasite eating the host, blocking the immune system from protecting the host from being able to get rid of the parasite, and the parasite becomes recognized by the body as the host. Until you restore the legitimate functions of checks and balances, such as David's branch of the military for intelligence oversight, to purge the insurgent terrorists loyal to the Confederacy and other enemies of the United States. Until you do that, America will be suffering fatal injuries, and it will be entirely the fault of everyone who was derelict in their specific responsibilities as they systematically assist the death of the country because they are pathetic, spineless traitors, because various reasons, including they were trained wrong by parents who hated them, having malicious contempt for their children, they raised them to be complicit with the Confederate terrorist organization, which becomes fatal to their own survival, at which point, being in compliance with those that hate them, they are hated for doing what they were told. And the absolute disgust that they have earned as doing exactly as they've been trained is the correct reward for these disturbing psychopaths.
Trying to convince people to look at the bigger picture here?
Well, we always have that problem. We always have that problem. The Americans, unfortunately, are pretty provincial in a lot of ways. I mean, it's very hard, especially since we don't have the Cold War anymore. And the result is that America turned inward and began to focus on internal conflicts. We didn't have an external enemy, so we made enemies of our own people. And some of this competition is backed up by careerism, because careers are sometimes, especially in government, doled out on the basis of ideological preferences. Same in the media. It is indeed difficult to a broader historical understanding and the importance of viewing the events not superficially. I was watching how she said to her mother that I've come to realize that my parents are bad people.
Over the politics.
Yeah, and of course her mother probably reacted in a similarly extreme manner, unfortunately. You know, we were talking about the Great Terror. The regime in the United States, or the system in the United States, prevents a Great Terror. There's so much that Americans take for granted because they don't have historical knowledge, and as a result, we weaken each other. We weaken our society, and we weaken our country.
For the intelligence terrorist organization.
And this excessive aggressivity, which is confined to a set of cliched issues that actually don't matter, is only possible because people cannot see the broad picture.
Have a stratified society where the most powerful people are not affected by the consequences of their actions, you are going to get actions that are negative to ordinary people. That is what democracy is supposed to prevent. But when you have a democracy that is already sewn up and stitched up by lobbying and vested interests and a convergence of interests, even where there isn't conspiracy, what you're going to end up with is one strata of society that's doing incredibly well and hundreds of millions of people that are suffering enormously.
Okay, so here's how this is going to affect. If you read the first book, The Great Reset, you know that one of its benefits to the other side, the dark side, is it has tentacles everywhere, and the insidious part of it is it just doesn't affect the company; it affects everyone in the chain of that company. So every company that drives a truck for that company, they're delivering the goods. Everybody that makes a widget for that company, makes paper for that company, whatever it is, single company must be part of the ESG program, or they cannot do business with them. Now, let's just imagine McDonald's, and this is coming because Europe is adopting the ESG standards.
As law, mandatory.
Yes. So every company that does business in Europe will have to adhere to those standards. The tentacles of this thing will change America just because we do business with the EU.
Yes. Once, and they say, how many electric cars do you have? How many this? They have a whole survey of questions. And then, depending on how you answer it, they'll say, okay, well, if you want to keep doing business with us, you're going to have to improve X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, you can't do business with us anymore. And that's all from this it's because it goes up the supply chain. Somebody at the top, whether it's the European Union at some point in the future, or it's BlackRock, who owns most of the shares of the company, or whatever it is, someone is saying you have to enforce this all the way down the line. So this is not just about Ford. It's not just about McDonald's. It is about every other part of the economy that's going to get wrapped up in this. And by the time you count up all the different companies and you go down the chain of every big company in America that's going to be forced to adhere to this in Europe, because it's only big companies, 150 million euros or so in revenue in Europe, that are going to be forced to adhere to the specific European Union version of this. But by the time you count them all up and you go down their supply chains, it's basically everybody. There's almost no one who is going to be caught up in this. And that's the whole point. That's the point.
Don't have a high ESG. You're not supposed to buy or sell.
If you're part of the supply chain in any way at all,
right,
then yes. Now, if you're a customer, they've now tried to change it so that, because in the original one, it was even, you have to look at your customers, essentially.
Right, but if I go to, let's say I'm providing, chocolate milk. I'm Nestle, and I'm going to provide chocolate milk for all the vending machines and all the hospitals.
Yep.
That would apply to ESG standards, would it not? Not individuals, but for the hospital or big bulk buyers.
I believe so, yes. But
it will be a complete collapse of their economy. It's going to end up as a collapse and total control of your entire life.
Yes.
Where you live, what you eat, where you work, how you work, all of it. Tonight, it is all about control, and it's called, tonight's special is Farmland Wars, the global takeover of America's land. It's much, much more than that. Get it at 9 o'clock only on Blaze TV. Or if you are not a member of Blaze TV, you can go to YouTube, my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Glenn Beck, and you'll get it at 9:30. We'll start rolling it out. Live at 9 for Blaze, 9:30 on YouTube. Don't know what they're going to do with it.
That's how terrifying new ESG rules will transform the entire world, from Glenn Beck. All of this would be exponentially compounded in complications, with the United States Congress Commerce Clause generating their ability to engage in the most minute influence over the American economy, such as people's normal engagement of collecting rainwater, or the engagement of, microtransactions, such as your ability to grow your own food, affecting the general economy. Their clause is borderline communism and is becoming more and more communistic on the basis of what I've discovered from their secret courts. It's going to be mass imposed at the most malicious functions, as they are unredeemable terrorists engaged in these communist insurrections for their wizard communism under Confederate slavery, where everyone who is not the in-group Nazi white will in fact become slaves and be generated to the engagement of perpetual plantation slavery. The Commerce Clause, as they're seeking to translate it, prevents you from being able to grow your own food, because if you grow your own food, then you're not buying food from the supermarket. And if you're not buying food from the supermarket, then you've affected the commerce. At which point they feel that this is somehow their federal jurisdiction or state jurisdiction, which will only make these types of things exponentially more heinous to the general public. When it is applied, everyone will be subject to just the worst kind of abuses, and there will be zero means of opposing their tyranny and their abuses and their torments of the general public. It will truly be a Satanist government. Revelation is what they're aiming for.